Hello, my friends. It's really cold out here and I haven't heated up the car, but I'm anxious to finish up this part of the video series that I'm doing, so I'm going to try to make this quick. Made myself notes again. So, I explained various arguments in this series, some of which I'm not even sure are good arguments. I did the Kalam cosmological argument, the argument from contingency, the fine-tuning argument, the moral argument, and the ontological argument or aontological argument. 5 arguments. To rank these in the order in which I personally find them persuasive, I would put the moral argument at the top, and then right below that, the Kalam argument and the argument from contingency are tied for second place. The fine-tuning argument is third. You know, it's interesting about the fine-tuning argument because there's a lot of people who are not Christians who think that should be on the top. But like I said, I'm warming up to that one. You know, maybe the more I learn, the more convincing it will become. And then in last place is the ontological argument, which I suspect is a sound argument, but I don't consider it a good argument because I don't think you can prove the first premise without begging the question. Okay, so if you took these arguments individually, you might say, well, one argument gives you a creator, but it doesn't tell you it's a person, or it doesn't tell you other things about it. Another gives you a designer, but it doesn't tell you whether it's a moral being. Another gives you a perfect moral authority, but it doesn't give you a creator. And so you might be tempted to think, well, these arguments could all be talking about completely different beings. Why think they're all the same being? Well, the reason for that is because of how they complement each other and how they kind of cohere with each other. And let me give you some examples. The Kalam cosmological argument explains why the universe exists, but it doesn't explain why the thing that brought the universe into existence also exists. Why does it exist? Why does anything at all exist? Well, that is answered by the argument from contingency. It's because the thing that's responsible, the thing that sits at the ground of all reality, is a necessary being. And by the nature of a necessary being, it's impossible for it to not exist. The fine-tuning argument explains how the universe came to be conducive to life because it has a designer, but it doesn't explain how that designer got its design into the universe in the first place, and it also doesn't explain why it designed the universe to support life to begin with. Well, that argument can be answered by the moral argument and the Kalam cosmological argument. The Kalam cosmological argument tells you that the universe came into being, it was created or whatever. So the design got into the universe by way of creation. And the moral argument can give you a reason for why the designer designed the universe to inhabit life. It's because as being a perfectly moral creature, you would think that it would want to produce other moral creatures capable of moral agency, so that these moral creatures could exemplify moral properties like courage, self-sacrifice, that sort of thing. And also, by creating sentient beings like ourselves, it enabled there to be an appreciation for things like beauty and goodness, and especially an appreciation for the goodness of the Creator himself. The moral argument explains where morals come from. It comes from a sovereign authoritative being, but it doesn't explain how anything could have that kind of moral authority. Well, that is explained by the cosmological arguments. It can have moral authority because there's this absolute ground of all being. Everything else owes its existence to this necessary being, and reality revolves around that being. It's hard to think of anything else that would suffice for something to have absolute moral authority. And so you can see how all these arguments kind of complement each other. They explain each other and stuff like that. And so it would seem that they're all talking about the same being. Now, even so, that doesn't prove that it's the Christian God, because the Christian God has a lot of properties that these arguments don't show. None of these arguments show that the being is all-knowing or all-powerful, or one of them does show that it's perfectly good, but it should still make us suspicious that it's the Christian God. And I want to read something that I wrote just this morning, because I struggled a little bit with the wording of this, and I know good and well that if I tried to just tell it to you out of memory, I would have all kinds of aphasia events. So I'm just going to read to you what I wrote. If these arguments are sound, then there is a necessary personal being who is the absolute foundational ground of all reality, who is spaceless, timeless, immaterial, sentient, intelligent, and morally perfect, with absolute sovereign autonomy and moral authority, who designed the universe so that it would be habitable by living creatures capable of moral awareness and agency, and brought that universe into being out of nothing, and who rules and governs the universe by imposing moral obligations on its creation, and by investing creatures with the moral knowledge so that they can know what is required of them. To me, that sounds a lot like the Abrahamic God. So it seems like even if they don't absolutely prove it's the Abrahamic God, they do give us reason to suspect it might be, and so that alone should be enough reason for us to want to look into the Abrahamic God. After all, what other religion has a God like that? I mean, there are a lot of religions with a lot of different gods and a lot of different creation stories, but hardly any of them have like a necessary being who's the ground of everything else that exists. Most of it, especially one that's morally perfect, most of them have a morally imperfect God, or a God who's not the absolute ground of all being, and who brought the universe into being out of pre-existing material, or usually who brought some part of the universe into being, or something like that. A lot of gods are birthed from previously existing gods, things like that. So there's hardly any of them, and honestly none that I'm aware of. Maybe Zoroastrianism, and there was one other religion that I heard of. Even in Zoroastrianism, you don't have an absolutely autonomous and sovereign God. You've got two equal opposite gods. But it seems like the Abrahamic God is pretty unique in being cohering with what you can call, I guess, the God of the philosophers and stuff. And so the interesting thing is that the Jewish people did not come up with this God by the use of these arguments. So if this God that I've explained, let's call it the God of the philosophers, if this God really exists, then either it's a huge coincidence that the Jewish people invented a God that is so much like the real God, or that God actually revealed himself to the Jewish people in the past, and that explains why the Jewish people have this God that resembles the God of the philosophers. So it seems to me that this is a good reason to at least be suspicious that the God of the philosophers is the God of Abraham, and at the very least, it seems like a good reason to look into the God of Abraham and to see if the God of Abraham is the same person as the God of the philosophers. And that's what I'm going to do in the second half of my series that I'm doing here. I'm going to make a historical argument, basically, that God revealed himself through Jesus of Nazareth, and that Jesus is the Messiah, that he died and that he rose from the dead. And that shows that Jesus, God, is the true God. So there you have it. Stay with me.